Hi, I'm Camille, and yesterday my sister Cassey tagged me in another broke sister meme on Instagram in front of all our mutual friends, but what she didn't know was that I had just gotten off a call with my private banker about transferring $2 million to close on my third investment property. For months Cassey had been publicly humiliating me with these memes, posting pictures of women in thrift store clothes with captions like "When your sister still shops at clearance racks" and POV, "Your sister asks to borrow $20 for gas." She'd tag me every single time, letting our entire family and friend network see her little jokes about my supposedly pathetic financial situation. But here's the thing, while she was busy making memes about my broke lifestyle, I was quietly building a seven-figure investment portfolio. Have you ever watched someone mock you for something that's the complete opposite of your reality? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The notification sound on my phone had become a trigger. Every time I heard that familiar ping, my stomach would drop slightly, wondering if it was another one of Cassey's broke sister posts. This particular Tuesday morning was no different, except this time, the timing couldn't have been more ironic. I was sitting in my home office in Millbrook Heights, reviewing quarterly reports from my investment portfolio, when my phone buzzed. The Instagram notification showed exactly what I expected. Cassey had tagged me in another meme. This one featured a woman digging through couch cushions with the caption, "When your sister is looking for gas money again #broke sister problems #family life." 12 mutual friends had already liked it. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. At that exact moment, I had 3 browser tabs open, one showing my brokerage account with its 7-figure balance, another displaying the pending wire transfer for my latest real estate acquisition, and a third containing the property listing for a downtown commercial building I was considering purchasing. Yet according to Cassey's carefully curated social media narrative, I was the family failure who couldn't afford to fill up my gas tank. This wasn't the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Over the past 8 months, Cassey had developed what seemed like a compulsion to publicly document what she perceived as my financial struggles. There was the meme about that relative who always orders water at restaurants, tagged with my name, and shared to her 2,000 followers. The post about "When your sister asks to borrow your Netflix password because she's too broke for her own," complete with laughing emojis and my Instagram handle prominently displayed. Each one garnered dozens of likes and comments from our extended family and mutual friends, creating a public narrative about my life that was completely divorced from reality. What made it particularly stinging was how calculated it all seemed. Cassey didn't just post these memes randomly, she chose moments when our entire family would see them. Family birthday posts, holiday gatherings, even condolence messages. When our great-aunt passed away, somehow became opportunities for her to slip in subtle digs about my supposed poverty. She had weaponized social media to create a public perception of me that served her narrative while keeping her image as the successful, generous sister intact. The truth was, I had been living below my means by choice, not necessity. While Cassey flaunted her lifestyle with posts from expensive restaurants, designer shopping hauls, and luxury vacation photos, I had been quietly building wealth through strategic investments and calculated financial decisions. My modest apartment in Millbrook Heights wasn't a sign of financial struggle, it was prime real estate in an up-and-coming neighborhood that I had purchased 3 years ago when property values were low. My 10-year-old Honda Civic wasn't a symbol of poverty, it was a paid-off, reliable vehicle that allowed me to invest the money most people spent on car payments. But explaining this to people would have meant revealing the extent of my financial success, something I wasn't ready to do. I had learned early in my investment journey that discussing money made people uncomfortable, envious, or judgmental. It was easier to let people make assumptions than to deal with the complex dynamics that came with financial transparency. So I let Cassey tell her story, even when it painted me as the struggling younger sister who needed constant help. The problem was that her harmless jokes were starting to affect real relationships. Our cousin Lovely had stopped inviting me to dinner parties, presumably because she thought I couldn't afford to reciprocate. Our Uncle Ronan had begun slipping me $20 bills at family gatherings with a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. Even our parents had started having concerned conversations about my situation, offering to help with everything from groceries to rent payments I didn't need. Cassey's memes weren't just embarrassing, they were rewriting my story in real time, creating a version of me that existed only in her imagination but was becoming reality in everyone else's mind. And the most frustrating part was that I couldn't defend myself without seeming petty or having to reveal information I preferred to keep private. As I stared at the latest meme on my phone, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. Cassie's public campaign was starting to impact how people treated me, how they viewed my capabilities, and how they measured my worth. She was creating a narrative that diminished me while elevating herself, and she was doing it with the casual cruelty that only family members can truly master. I set my phone down and returned to my computer screen, where the numbers told a very different story. My investment portfolio had grown by 15% over the past quarter. The real estate deal I was finalizing would add another property to my growing collection. The business partnerships I had cultivated were generating steady passive income streams that exceeded what most people made in their primary careers. But none of that mattered in the court of public opinion that Cassey had created. In her version of reality, I was the sister who needed saving, the cautionary tale, the family member who served as a contrast to her success. And until something forced the truth into the light, that narrative would continue to shape how our entire social circle saw me. I had no idea that in less than 24 hours, a single phone call would shatter her carefully constructed fiction and reveal the truth she had been so determined to hide. The history between Cassey and me didn't start with social media, but the platforms had given her a new weapon in an old war. Growing up, we had been what people politely called competitive siblings, though looking back, it felt more like I had been drafted into a competition I never wanted to enter. Cassey was 3 years older, which in childhood terms meant she had a significant head start in everything that mattered to our parents. She was the first to walk, the first to read, the first to bring home honor roll certificates and soccer trophies. By the time I reached the same milestones, they felt less like achievements and more like delayed inevitabilities. Our parents would smile and nod when I succeeded, but there was always an undertone of finally rather than fantastic. This dynamic continued through high school and college, where Cassey chose highly visible paths that generated immediate recognition. She studied communications, joined the most popular sorority, and landed internships at companies with recognizable names. Meanwhile, I gravitated toward finance and economics, subjects that seemed boring to most people but fascinated me. While Cassey was posting pictures from fraternity parties and spring break trips, I was buried in textbooks learning about market analysis and investment strategies. After graduation, our paths diverged even more dramatically. Cassey moved to Beacon City and took a marketing position at a mid-sized firm. Her salary was decent, and more importantly, it came with the kind of lifestyle that translated well to social media. Corporate events, team-building retreats, and client dinners provided endless content for her Instagram feed. She seemed to be living the life that everyone expected from a successful young professional. I chose a different route. Instead of pursuing traditional employment, I used my finance degree to secure a position at a small investment firm in Millbrook Heights. The pay was modest, but the education was invaluable. I spent 2 years learning the intricacies of wealth management, market analysis, and investment strategy from professionals who managed portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. More importantly, I was building relationships with clients who eventually became mentors and in some cases business partners. The difference in our chosen paths became apparent during family gatherings. Cassey would arrive with stories about office politics, weekend getaways, and shopping sprees that she documented extensively on social media. Her life looked exciting, successful, and enviable. When relatives asked about my work, I would mention the investment firm, but it was difficult to make asset allocation and portfolio management sound as interesting as Cassey's marketing campaigns and client presentations. What our family didn't understand was that I was learning skills that would compound over time. While Cassey was spending her income on lifestyle and experiences, I was investing nearly 70% of everything I earned. I lived in a small apartment, drove a used car, and bought most of my clothes from discount retailers. To external observers, especially family members, this looked like financial struggle. In reality, it was financial strategy. The first major shift came 3 years after graduation, when I left the investment firm to start managing my own portfolio full-time. By that point, my savings and investments had grown enough to generate income that exceeded my modest living expenses. But explaining this to family required revealing details about my financial situation that I preferred to keep private. It was easier to let people assume I was between jobs or figuring things out than to explain that I was transitioning to full-time investing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cassey, meanwhile, had been promoted twice and was living in a trendy apartment in downtown Beacon City. Her social media presence had evolved into what could only be described as lifestyle branding. Every meal, every outfit, every weekend activity was documented and shared. She had cultivated an image of success that looked impressive and felt aspirational to her followers. The problem was that her version of success required constant income to maintain. The apartment, the car payments, the designer clothes, the frequent dining out, it all created a lifestyle that looked wealthy but actually consumed most of her earnings. She was living paycheck to paycheck, but her paychecks were large enough to fund a lifestyle that appeared financially secure. My lifestyle, by contrast, looked modest from the outside. I still lived in the same small apartment, still drove the same reliable car, still shopped at discount stores. But underneath this unimpressive exterior, my net worth was growing exponentially. The investments I had made in my early 20s were generating returns that I reinvested, creating a compound growth effect that accelerated each year. The irony was that Cassey's impressive lifestyle was actually more financially precarious than my modest one. She was one job loss or major expense away from serious financial difficulty, while I had built enough wealth to be financially independent. But appearances mattered more than reality in the court of family opinion, and Cassey's appearances were undeniably more impressive than mine. This context made her broke sister memes particularly painful. She wasn't just making jokes about my lifestyle choices, she was weaponizing the very financial discipline that was building my wealth and turning it into evidence of failure. Every meme that mocked my thrift store clothes or my reluctance to spend money on expensive dinners was actually mocking the choices that were making me financially secure. But I couldn't explain this without revealing information I wasn't ready to share. So I endured the jokes, the pitying looks from relatives, and the growing narrative that positioned me as the family member who needed help. Meanwhile, my investment portfolio continued to grow, and my financial independence became more secure with each passing month. I had no idea that this delicate balance between private success and public perception was about to be shattered by something as simple as a bank error and a very poorly timed phone call. Millbrook Heights existed in that sweet spot between urban convenience and suburban tranquility, a neighborhood that most people passed through without really noticing. The tree-lined streets were wide enough for comfortable walking, but narrow enough to feel intimate. Coffee shops with locally roasted beans sat next to family-owned bookstores, and the farmers market every Saturday drew residents from across 3 zip codes. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian house, painted sage green with white trim that the landlord refreshed every other year. From my living room window, I could see the tops of oak trees that had been planted when the neighborhood was first developed in the 1920s. It wasn't glamorous, but it was exactly what I had wanted when I moved there 3 years ago. Affordable rent in an area with strong appreciation potential. The building itself housed 6 units, and I knew all my neighbors by name. Mrs. Alora Sterling lived below me and grew herbs on the shared back porch that she generously allowed everyone to use. James Adams, a graphic designer who worked from home, lived across the hall and often accepted packages for me when I was out. We had the kind of neighborly relationships that felt increasingly rare in modern urban living. Friendly but not intrusive, helpful but respectful of boundaries. This was the world where I had built my quiet financial empire, surrounded by people who saw me as the friendly young woman who always said hello in the hallways and occasionally baked cookies for building-wide celebrations. They knew I worked from home doing something with computers and numbers, but the specifics of my investment activities weren't the kind of thing that came up in casual conversation. My home office occupied what had originally been designed as a dining room, with large windows that faced east and provided excellent natural light during morning trading hours. I had invested in a standing desk, 2 large monitors, and a comfortable chair that supported the long hours I spent analyzing market trends and researching investment opportunities. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing finance texts, market analysis reports, and printed copies of research that I referenced regularly. To someone unfamiliar with investment work, the space might have looked cluttered or confusing. Charts and graphs covered a large bulletin board, showing everything from sector performance to individual stock movements over various time periods. Post-it notes with color-coded systems tracked different aspects of my portfolio, from dividend payment dates to rebalancing schedules. Multiple notebooks contained handwritten analysis and calculations that supplemented the digital tracking systems I used. But this organized chaos was where the magic happened. Every morning, I would settle into my desk chair with a cup of coffee and spend the first hour reviewing overnight market movements, reading analyst reports, and checking on international developments that might affect my holdings. The routine was methodical and calming, a stark contrast to the high-stress trading environments that most people associated with investment work. The beauty of my approach was that it didn't require the constant monitoring and split-second decision-making that characterized day trading or active portfolio management. Instead, I focused on long-term growth strategies, carefully researched investments, and patient capital appreciation. This meant I could live a relatively relaxed lifestyle, while my money worked for me in the background. My daily routine reflected this balance between financial focus and personal peace. Mornings were dedicated to market research and portfolio management. Afternoons often included walks through the neighborhood, visits to the local coffee shop, where I would read or catch up on financial news, or trips to the community center, where I had started volunteering with their financial literacy program. Evenings were typically spent reading, cooking, or video calling with friends who had moved to other cities after college. This lifestyle looked unremarkable from the outside, which was exactly how I preferred it. Neighbors saw me leaving for coffee or returning from the grocery store, but they didn't see the laptop screens showing six-figure investment accounts or the paperwork for real estate transactions that could buy most of their homes outright. The disconnect between my apparent lifestyle and my actual financial situation was so complete that even I sometimes forgot how dramatically different my reality was from people's perceptions. The contrast became particularly stark when Cassey would visit, which thankfully wasn't often. She would arrive in her leased BMW, dressed in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and immediately begin photographing everything with a critical eye that suggested she was documenting poverty rather than visiting family. The small apartment, the modest furnishings, the absence of obvious luxury items, all of it became evidence for her narrative about my struggling financial situation. During her last visit, 6 months ago, she had actually taken a picture of my refrigerator with its collection of takeout menus and grocery store coupons magneted to the door. She posted it later with the caption, "When your sister's decorating budget is whatever comes in the mail #broke sister life #family visits." The post received 43 likes and a dozen sympathetic comments from relatives who apparently thought I was too poor to afford proper refrigerator decorations. What Cassey didn't know was that the takeout menus were from restaurants I had researched as potential investment opportunities, and the coupons were part of a deliberate strategy to minimize unnecessary expenses so I could maximize investment contributions. The refrigerator itself was a 10-year-old model that worked perfectly well and would be replaced only when it stopped functioning, not when it stopped looking impressive. This was the world I had created for myself, comfortable, functional, and designed to support financial growth rather than social appearance. It was a world where a $20 grocery budget was a choice rather than a necessity, where driving a paid-off car was a strategy rather than a limitation, and where living modestly was the foundation for building substantial wealth. But it was also a world that was completely invisible to people who measured success by consumption rather than accumulation. And unfortunately, my sister was very much one of those people. The memes started innocuously enough, almost like inside jokes between sisters. The first one appeared on Cassey's Instagram story about 4 months ago, a picture of a woman counting coins with the caption, "When you're broke but trying to look financially responsible." She had tagged me with a crying laughing emoji, and at the time I assumed it was harmless sibling teasing. But as weeks passed, the posts became more frequent and more pointed. What began as occasional jokes evolved into a systematic campaign of public humiliation, disguised as family humor. Cassey had discovered that content about her broke sister generated significant engagement from her followers, and she began mining our relationship for material with increasing frequency. The pattern became predictable and painful. Every family gathering, every holiday, every milestone became an opportunity for Cassey to document what she portrayed as my financial struggles. When our cousin Genevieve got engaged, Cassey posted a meme about when your sister can't afford to be in the wedding party. When our parents celebrated their anniversary with a dinner at an upscale restaurant, she shared a post about family dinners, where someone always orders the cheapest thing on the menu, with my name prominently tagged. Each post followed a similar formula, a relatable meme image paired with a caption that specifically referenced my supposed poverty, always tagged with my Instagram handle to ensure maximum visibility. The comments sections became echo chambers of sympathy and amusement, with relatives and mutual friends expressing everything from concern about my situation to admiration for Cassey's patience with her struggling sister. What made the situation particularly devastating was how it affected real relationships within our family. Our Aunt Daisy, who had always been close to me, began sending care packages filled with generic household items and gift cards to grocery stores. The packages arrived with notes expressing how proud she was of me for managing during difficult times and assuring me that things would get better soon. Each delivery was both touching and heartbreaking. Touching because it demonstrated genuine care. Heartbreaking because it was based on a completely fabricated narrative. Our Uncle Ronan started behaving differently at family gatherings too. Instead of engaging in the political debates and sports discussions that had always characterized our conversations, he began speaking to me in a softer, more careful tone typically reserved for people going through crises. He would ask how I was holding up and whether I needed help with anything. His eyes filled with the kind of concern usually directed toward family members facing serious hardships. The most painful shift came from our parents. During a video call 3 weeks ago, they had gently suggested that I might want to consider moving back home temporarily to save money. They offered to clear out the guest room and assured me that there was no shame in needing family support during challenging periods. The conversation was filled with love and good intentions, but it was based entirely on false information that Cassey had been systematically spreading through her social media posts. Meanwhile, Cassey's online presence continued to flourish. Her broke sister content had become so popular that followers began asking for updates and requesting more stories about our family dynamics. She obliged with increasingly elaborate posts that painted detailed pictures of my supposed financial struggles. There was the story about how I had to borrow money for gas, the tale about my inability to afford Christmas gifts, and the ongoing saga of my apparent inability to pay for meals when we went out together. None of these stories were true, but they were crafted with just enough plausible detail to seem authentic. Cassey would take real situations, like my preference for cooking at home, or my habit of carpooling to family events, and reframe them as evidence of financial desperation, rather than personal choice. She had become a master of narrative manipulation, turning my deliberate lifestyle decisions into proof of involuntary poverty. The irony was that during this same period, my investment portfolio was experiencing unprecedented growth. The technology stocks I had purchased 2 years earlier were delivering returns that exceeded my most optimistic projections. The real estate investment trust I had researched and bought into was paying quarterly dividends that alone exceeded what most people my age spent on rent. My carefully constructed investment strategy was generating wealth at a pace that surprised even me. But this success was invisible to everyone around me because I had deliberately chosen to live below my means and avoid conspicuous consumption. While Cassey documented every expensive purchase and luxury experience, I was reinvesting profits and building compound growth that would provide long-term financial security. The visual contrast between our lifestyles supported her narrative perfectly. She looked successful, and I looked struggling. The breaking point came 3 days ago, during our family's monthly dinner at Grandview Restaurant, a local establishment that had been hosting our gatherings for the past 5 years. Cassey arrived 15 minutes late, apologizing profusely and explaining that she had been delayed by an important work call. She was dressed impeccably, as always in a designer blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. As we reviewed the menu, she launched into her usual performance. "Oh Camille, don't worry about ordering whatever you want," she announced loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "I've got this tonight. Consider it my treat for my little sister, who's been working so hard lately." The comment was accompanied by the kind of exaggerated generosity that people use when they want to ensure their kindness is noticed and appreciated by observers. I had ordered a moderately priced salmon dish, something I would have chosen regardless of who was paying, but Cassey's announcement transformed my selection into evidence of my supposed need for financial assistance. Other family members nodded approvingly at her generosity, and I caught our server giving me the sympathetic look that service industry workers reserve for customers they perceive as financially disadvantaged. After dinner, while we waited for the check, Cassey pulled out her phone and began crafting what would become her most elaborate post yet. She took a picture of the restaurant receipt, strategically angled to show the total amount, while obscuring specific details, and began typing a caption that described her evening of treating my sister to a nice dinner, because everyone deserves to feel special sometimes, even when money is tight. As I watched her compose this fictional narrative about my life, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't playful sibling teasing anymore. This was systematic character assassination, disguised as family humor, and it was affecting real relationships with real consequences. Cassey was building her online brand by tearing down my reputation, and she was doing it with the casual cruelty that only comes from genuine indifference to another person's dignity. That night, as I sat in my apartment reviewing the day's market performance and calculating the returns on my latest investments, I realized that something had to change. The disconnect between my actual situation and Cassey's fictional narrative had grown so extreme that it was becoming unsustainable. but I had no idea that the universe was about to force the truth into the open in the most dramatic way possible. The week following the restaurant incident felt different, charged with a tension I couldn't quite name. Cassie's social media campaign had reached a new level of audacity, and I found myself checking my phone with increasing dread, never knowing when the next public humiliation would arrive. But something else was building too, a sense that this delicate balance I had maintained for so long was becoming impossible to sustain. The first crack in the facade came during a conversation with our cousin Lovely, who called Tuesday evening to chat about wedding planning. She was getting married in 6 months, and had originally planned to ask me to be a bridesmaid, but the conversation took an unexpected turn. "Camille, I hope you don't mind me asking," she began carefully, "but Cassey mentioned that things have been really tight for you lately. I just want you to know that if being in the wedding party would be a financial strain, we could maybe work something out with the dress costs or..." Her voice trailed off, and I realized she was trying to gracefully offer financial assistance for wedding expenses I could easily afford. The bridesmaid dress she was worried about probably cost less than what I spent on coffee in a typical month, but Cassie's narrative had convinced Lovely that such an expense would represent a genuine hardship for me. "That's really thoughtful of you," I managed, "but I'm doing fine, really. I'd love to be in your wedding party if you want me there." There was a pause that lasted just a beat too long. "Of course I want you there," Lovely said, but her tone carried the kind of forced enthusiasm people use when they're trying to include someone they feel sorry for. "I just know things have been challenging, and I don't want to add any pressure." After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, processing what had just happened. Lovely's kindness was genuine, but it was based on a completely false understanding of my situation. Cassie's memes had created a version of me that was so convincing, even close family members were making decisions based on fictional financial circumstances. The next incident came Friday morning during my regular coffee run to Beacon Cafe, a local spot where I had become a familiar face over the past 2 years. Kelvin, the owner, was working the counter when I arrived, and instead of our usual friendly greeting, he approached me with an expression of concern. "Hey Camille," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I hope this isn't weird, but I saw those posts your sister's been making. I just want you to know that if you ever need to work some extra hours, I could probably use help with bookkeeping or inventory management. Nothing fancy, but it might help with expenses." My stomach dropped. Kelvin was offering me part-time work because he believed I was struggling financially. This man, who had no reason to follow my family's social media drama, had apparently seen enough of Cassie's posts to conclude that I needed employment assistance. "That's incredibly kind of you," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "but I'm actually doing okay, just living simply by choice." He nodded, but his expression suggested he interpreted my response as pride preventing me from accepting help I clearly needed. "Well, the offer stands if anything changes," he said with the gentle persistence of someone who had decided to be helpful regardless of my protests. As I walked home with my coffee, I realized that Cassie's narrative was spreading beyond our immediate family circle. Mutual friends, local business owners, and acquaintances were all receiving the same message. Camille was struggling, Cassey was helping, and everyone should feel appropriately sympathetic toward my situation. That afternoon brought the most jarring incident yet. I was returning from a walk when I encountered Mrs. Sterling from the apartment below mine. She was standing by our shared mailboxes, holding a small paper bag that she immediately extended toward me. "I picked up an extra loaf of bread from the bakery," she explained with the kind of casual tone that indicated this was definitely not casual. "I thought you might enjoy it." The bag contained an artisanal sourdough loaf from the expensive bakery downtown, the kind of bread that cost $12 and was generally purchased as a treat rather than a staple. Mrs. Sterling was clearly offering me food because she believed I couldn't afford to buy it myself. "Mrs. Sterling, this is so thoughtful, but you really don't need to." "Nonsense," she interrupted gently. "We all go through difficult periods. Community means looking out for each other." As I accepted the bread and thanked her for her kindness, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Her generosity was touching, but it was also evidence of how effectively Cassey had transformed me into an object of pity in the eyes of people who interacted with me regularly. That evening, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to my investment advisor, requesting a comprehensive portfolio summary that would document my current financial position. If this situation was going to force me to reveal the truth about my circumstances, I wanted to have complete and accurate information available. The numbers, when they arrived Saturday morning, were even more impressive than I had realized. My diversified investment portfolio had grown to $2.3 million, generating annual income that exceeded what most professionals earned in traditional careers. The real estate holdings I had accumulated over the past 3 years were valued at an additional $800,000, and the rental income from 2 properties provided steady monthly cash flow that could support a comfortable lifestyle without touching principal investments. Staring at these figures, I felt a strange mixture of pride and frustration. I had achieved financial independence at 28 years old through discipline, research, and strategic decision-making. By any reasonable measure, I was extraordinarily successful. Yet the people closest to me believed I was struggling to afford basic necessities. The final straw came Saturday evening, when Cassey posted her most elaborate and damaging content yet. She had created what amounted to a photo essay titled Sister Support Saturday, featuring pictures from our recent family dinner, along with detailed captions, describing her ongoing efforts to help me through my challenging financial period. The post included photos of the restaurant receipt, strategically cropped to emphasize the total amount she had paid, along with commentary about how important it was to support family members who are working hard but haven't caught their break yet. She tagged multiple family members and encouraged her followers to share stories about helping relatives through difficult times. Within 2 hours, the post had generated over 100 likes and dozens of comments from relatives, family friends, and complete strangers, all praising Cassey's generosity and expressing sympathy for my situation. Several people shared their own stories about helping struggling siblings, creating a narrative thread that positioned me as part of a broader category of family members who needed ongoing support. Reading through the comments, I realized that Cassey's campaign had succeeded beyond what I had imagined possible. She had created a public identity for me that was completely divorced from reality, and that identity was now being reinforced by a community of people who had no reason to question her version of events. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by financial documents that proved my actual success while reading social media posts that described my fictional failure, I understood that this situation had moved beyond the realm of family dynamics. Cassey wasn't just embarrassing me anymore. She was actively damaging my reputation and relationships for her own social media gain. I had spent months hoping the situation would resolve itself, that Cassey would eventually tire of her broke sister content and move on to other topics. But her posts were becoming more frequent and more elaborate, suggesting that she had found a sustainable source of online engagement that she had no intention of abandoning. Something had to change, and I suspected that change was coming sooner than I anticipated. My phone was charging on the kitchen counter, silent for the moment, but I had a strange feeling that tomorrow would bring the catalyst that would finally force this carefully constructed fiction into collision with unavoidable reality. I had no idea how right I was, or how dramatically everything would change with a single phone call that would arrive at exactly the wrong moment for Cassey's narrative, and exactly the right moment for the truth. Sunday brunch at our parents' house was supposed to be a peaceful family tradition, the kind of relaxed gathering that provided content for wholesome social media posts, rather than dramatic confrontations. Our mother, Joanne, had been hosting these monthly brunches for 3 years, creating elaborate spreads of homemade quiche, fresh fruit, and artisanal pastries that she arranged with the precision of a magazine photographer. This particular Sunday felt different from the moment I arrived. Cassey was already there, positioned strategically near the kitchen island, with her phone propped against a decorative bowl, clearly preparing to document the gathering for her social media audience. She had dressed for the occasion in a flowing sundress that photographed beautifully, and had already taken several shots of the food arrangement before other family members arrived. "Oh good, Camille's here," she announced as I walked through the front door, her voice carrying the tone of someone narrating for an invisible audience. "Now we can really get this family brunch started." Our parents, Joanne and Nelson, embraced me with the careful warmth that had characterized their interactions with me ever since Cassey's social media campaign had convinced them I was struggling financially. There was an extra tenderness in their greetings, the kind of gentle concern typically reserved for family members going through difficult periods. "How are you doing, sweetheart?" our father asked, his hand resting on my shoulder with protective intention. "Your mother made that quiche recipe you used to love when you were younger. We thought it might be nice to have some comfort food." The implication was clear. They believed I needed comforting, presumably because my financial situation was causing stress that required familial support. I managed a smile and assured them I was doing well, though I could see in their expressions that they interpreted my response as brave deflection rather than honest assessment. Cassey had already begun her documentation process, taking candid shots of family interactions, while providing running commentary that would later become captions for her various social media posts. I watched her photograph our father serving me a generous portion of quiche, undoubtedly planning to frame it as another example of family members taking care of their struggling relative. "Isn't this nice?" she said, ostensibly to the room, but clearly for her phone's camera. "Family time is so important, especially when we can all be here together supporting each other through everything life throws at us." The coded language was becoming second nature to her. Every reference to support and being there for each other would be understood by her followers as allusions to my supposed financial difficulties, and her ongoing role as the generous sister helping me through hard times. Our Aunt Daisy and Uncle Ronan arrived 20 minutes later, bringing their characteristic energy, and immediately engaging in conversations about upcoming family events, neighborhood gossip, and political developments. For a brief period, the gathering felt normal, like the comfortable family brunches I remembered from before Cassey had turned our relationship into content for public consumption. But the normalcy was deceptive. I noticed the subtle ways that conversations were being steered away from topics that might be sensitive for someone experiencing financial hardship. When Uncle Ronan mentioned an upcoming vacation to Europe, he quickly changed the subject after catching our mother's warning glance. When Aunt Daisy started describing an expensive renovation project, she interrupted herself mid-sentence and began talking about budget-friendly decorating ideas instead. Everyone was walking on eggshells around me, carefully avoiding any discussion that might highlight the contrast between their financial security and my perceived struggles. The consideration was well-intentioned, but deeply painful, creating an atmosphere where I felt like a charity case rather than a family member. Cassey, meanwhile, was in her element. She had found the perfect balance between documenting the gathering and participating in it, creating content that portrayed her as the devoted sister who made sure family events were inclusive and supportive. Every photo she took seemed designed to reinforce the narrative she had been building. Successful Cassey caring for struggling Camille, in the warm embrace of family love. The conversation eventually turned to upcoming family milestones, including our cousin Lovely's wedding and our parents' anniversary celebration. As family members discussed plans, gifts, and logistics, I noticed the careful way they avoided asking for my input on anything that involved financial commitment. When our mother mentioned organizing a group gift for Lovely, she made eye contact with everyone except me. When Uncle Ronan suggested planning a surprise party for our parents' anniversary, he directed his planning questions toward Cassey and the other adults who were presumably capable of contributing meaningfully. I was being gently excluded from family planning, not out of malice, but out of misguided consideration for my supposed financial limitations. The exclusion was subtle but unmistakable, and it stung more than any of Cassey's memes had. "You know what would be fun?" Cassey said suddenly, raising her phone to capture what she clearly intended to be a spontaneous moment. "Let's all go around and share something we're grateful for. I'll start. I'm grateful for family that sticks together no matter what challenges we face." The gratitude exercise was obviously designed to generate content that would reinforce her narrative of family support during difficult times. As other family members shared their thoughts, expressing appreciation for health, relationships, and various blessings, I felt the familiar tension of being asked to perform gratitude, while my actual circumstances were being systematically misrepresented. When the attention turned to me, I was preparing to offer something generic about family love when my phone began ringing. The sound cut through the conversation like an alarm, and everyone looked toward my purse, where the insistent buzzing indicated an incoming call. "Sorry," I said, reaching for my phone. "I should probably just silence this." But as I glanced at the screen, my heart stopped. The caller ID showed, First National Private Banking, urgent. This was my private banker, the one who handled high-net-worth client accounts, and only called when something required immediate attention. The timing couldn't have been worse, or depending on perspective, more perfect. "I'm sorry, but I think I need to take this," I said, rising from my chair. "It might be important." Cassey's eyebrows raised with interest. "What kind of call could be so urgent on a Sunday morning?" she asked, her journalist instincts clearly activated by the unusual interruption. I stepped toward the kitchen, hoping to take the call privately, but the open floor plan of our parents' house made isolation impossible. Every word I spoke would be audible to the entire family gathering. "Hello, this is Camille," I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Miss Clark, this is Richard Chen, from First National Private Banking," came the crisp, professional voice on the other end. I apologize for calling on a Sunday, but we've encountered an issue with the wire transfer you initiated Friday for the Meridian Heights property acquisition. My stomach dropped. The banker was speaking in the clear, carrying voice that financial professionals use when discussing significant transactions, and every word was reaching my family members who had fallen silent with curiosity. The issue appears to be with the receiving bank's processing system, Richard continued, oblivious to my audience. The $2.3 million transfer was flagged for additional verification due to the international routing requirements. We need your authorization to split the transfer into 2 separate wires to expedite processing. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel every pair of eyes fixed on me as the banker continued explaining the technical details of moving $2.3 million from my account to purchase an investment property. The contrast between his words and Cassey's broke sister narrative was so stark that it created a surreal moment where reality seemed to be reasserting itself in the most dramatic way possible. Additionally, Richard continued, I wanted to confirm that you received the quarterly dividend reports we sent Friday. The portfolio performance this quarter exceeded projections by 12%, bringing your total assets under management to just over $4.1 million. The technology sector allocation you requested has been particularly strong. I glanced around the room and saw faces frozen in various stages of confusion, disbelief, and dawning realization. Cassey's phone had slowly lowered from its recording position, her expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching horror as she began to understand what she was hearing. Yes, I received the reports, I managed, trying to maintain some semblance of composure, while my carefully guarded financial privacy exploded in front of my entire family. Can we schedule a time tomorrow to discuss the transfer details? Of course, Miss Clark. I'll have my assistant coordinate with you first thing Monday morning. And congratulations again on the Meridian Heights acquisition. That property should provide excellent long-term appreciation potential given the planned development in that district. After I hung up, the silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. Everyone was staring at me with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to calculation as they tried to reconcile what they had just heard with everything they believed about my financial situation. Cassey was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. What was that about? That was my private banker, I said simply, seeing no point in evasion now that the truth had been forcibly revealed. There was an issue with a wire transfer for a real estate purchase. A $2.3 million wire transfer, Uncle Ronan repeated slowly, as if testing whether the words would make more sense the second time. For an investment property, I confirmed. Our mother was shaking her head in the confused way people do when trying to process information that contradicts everything they previously believed. Camille, I don't understand. If you have that kind of money, why have you been? Her voice trailed off as she realized she couldn't finish the sentence without acknowledging that their understanding of my situation had been completely wrong. All eyes turned to Cassey, who had gone pale and was gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles were white. The elaborate narrative she had been building for months, the broke sister, the financial struggles, the need for family support, had just been obliterated by a single phone call that revealed not only that I wasn't struggling, but that I was significantly wealthier than anyone in the room. I don't understand, she said, her voice cracking slightly. You live in that tiny apartment, you drive that old car, you never spend money on anything. Because I choose to live below my means, I said calmly. Because I invest instead of consuming. Because building wealth was more important to me than looking wealthy. The reality was settling over the room like fog, and I could see each family member processing the implications. Every sympathetic comment, every offer of financial help, every careful avoidance of money-related topics, all of it had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of my circumstances. But the most dramatic realization was happening on Cassey's face, as she understood that her months of broke sister content had just been exposed as complete fiction. Every meme, every post, every carefully crafted story about my financial struggles had been revealed as elaborate fabrication, and she had done it all in front of thousands of followers who now had access to the truth. Her social media empire, built on the foundation of my supposed poverty, had just collapsed in the most public and irrefutable way possible. The silence that followed my confirmation stretched so long that I could hear the grandfather clock in our parents' hallway marking each second with mechanical precision. 8 family members sat frozen around the brunch table, their expressions cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and dawning comprehension as they tried to reconcile this new information with months of assumptions about my life. Our mother was the first to attempt processing what she had heard. Camille, she began slowly, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone testing fragile ground. When you say you have $4 million, You mean in investments, like actual money that you could access? Yes, Mom, actual money, liquid assets, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios that I manage full-time. I kept my voice steady, factual, avoiding any trace of defensiveness that might suggest I was ashamed of my success. Our father leaned back in his chair, running his hand through his hair in the gesture he always made when trying to solve complex problems. But sweetheart, if that's true, why have you been living like? Why did we think you were struggling? The question hung in the air, and I realized this was the moment where I could either continue protecting everyone's feelings, or finally address the elephant that had been trampling through our family relationships for months. Because I said, looking directly at Cassey, someone has been very carefully crafting a narrative about my life that has nothing to do with reality. Cassey's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling on a pale green that suggested she was beginning to understand the full scope of what had just happened. Her phone lay face down on the table, abandoned for the first time in recent memory. I don't understand, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. You never said anything, you never corrected me when you what, Cassey? I asked, my voice remaining calm but gaining intensity. When you tagged me in memes about being broke. When you posted photos of restaurant receipts with captions about helping your struggling sister. When you created an entire social media persona based on my supposed poverty. Uncle Ronan cleared his throat uncomfortably. Now wait a minute, girls. Let's not. No, I interrupted, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. Let's actually talk about this. For 8 months, I've been watching my sister build her online brand by publicly humiliating me. I've listened to family members offer me jobs, food, and financial assistance because they believed I couldn't afford basic necessities. I've been excluded from family planning because everyone assumed I was too broke to contribute meaningfully. Aunt Daisy's eyes widened as she began connecting dots. Oh my God, those care packages I sent you. I thought you needed. I was so worried about you. I know you were worried, Aunt Daisy. And I appreciate that your concern came from love. But it was based on completely false information that was being systematically spread by someone who knew better. All eyes turned back to Cassey, who was now gripping the edge of the table as if it might anchor her to a reality that was rapidly shifting beneath her feet. I didn't know, she said weakly. How was I supposed to know you had money if you never told anyone? The defense was so inadequate that it seemed to surprise even her as she said it. Our mother's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger as she began to understand what had actually been happening. Cassey Marie, she said, using the full name that indicated serious trouble. Are you telling me that you've been posting things about your sister's financial situation without actually knowing what her financial situation was? I was just, the memes were funny. People liked them. You didn't think what? I asked, my voice rising slightly for the first time. You didn't think that publicly calling me broke would have consequences. You didn't think that family members would see those posts and believe them. You didn't think that creating a narrative about my life might affect how people treat me. Cassey's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. For someone who had spent months crafting elaborate captions and witty commentary, she seemed remarkably unable to find words when confronted with the reality of what her content had accomplished. Our father was shaking his head slowly, the way he did when processing information that disappointed him on multiple levels. Cassey, some of those posts, they weren't just jokes. You were asking people to feel sorry for Camille. You were encouraging a narrative that your sister needed help. And people responded to that narrative, I continued, feeling momentum building behind words I had been holding back for months. Mrs. Sterling brings me expensive bread because she thinks I can't afford groceries. Kelvin at the coffee shop offered me part-time work because he believes I need employment. Lovely was trying to figure out how to help me afford being in her wedding party. Each example landed like a physical blow, and I could see Cassey shrinking further into her chair as the scope of her impact became clear. Even you, I said, turning to address our parents, have been treating me differently. You offered to let me move back home. You've been walking on eggshells around any topic related to money. You've been excluding me from family planning because you thought I couldn't afford to participate. Our mother's eyes filled with tears as she realized how completely she had been manipulated by her older daughter's social media campaign. Oh, Camille, we were just trying to be supportive. We thought you were going through a hard time. I know, Mom, I know your intentions were good. But that's exactly what makes this so damaging. Cassey wasn't just embarrassing me. She was poisoning my relationships with people who care about me by feeding them false information designed to make them pity me. The weight of this realization settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Everyone was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about embarrassing social media posts. It was about the systematic destruction of my reputation and relationships for the sake of online engagement. Cassey finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go that far, but it did go that far, I replied. And it kept going further because every time people responded with sympathy and concern, you got more likes, more comments, more engagement. My supposed poverty became your most reliable content category. Uncle Ronan was studying Cassey with the expression he typically reserved for analyzing particularly disappointing business decisions. How many people have seen these posts, Cassey? She mumbled something inaudible. How many followers do you have? He pressed. About 3,000, she admitted, her voice barely audible. 3,000 people, our father repeated slowly. 3,000 people who now believe that Camille has been struggling financially for the past 8 months. The full scope of the reputational damage was beginning to dawn on everyone. This wasn't just family embarrassment, this was public character assassination on a scale that would be difficult to undo. And now, I continued, feeling a strange sense of liberation as I finally spoke the truth I had been carrying alone. All those people are going to see your sister, the one you've been portraying as broke, closing on multi-million-dollar real estate deals. They're going to realize that either you were completely wrong about my situation, or you were deliberately lying about it. Cassie's face went white as she understood the implications for her own credibility. If her broke sister content was exposed as fiction, what did that say about her reliability as a source of family stories and personal anecdotes? Can't you just not post about the real estate thing? She asked desperately. The question was so absurd that it actually made me laugh, though there was no humor in the sound. Cassey, I own 3 properties. I'm closing on a 4th. I manage a 7-figure investment portfolio. This isn't something I can hide indefinitely, and more importantly, it's not something I should have to hide. Aunt Daisy was looking back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, still trying to process the complete reversal of everything she had believed about our family dynamics. So when you ordered the salmon last week, she said slowly, and Cassey made that big show of paying for everyone. I could have bought the entire restaurant, I said simply. I ordered the salmon because I wanted salmon, not because I needed someone else to pay for it. The memory of that dinner took on an entirely different character when viewed through the lens of accurate information. Cassey's performance of generosity, the family's grateful acceptance of her largesse, the server's sympathetic glances in my direction, all of it had been based on a completely fabricated premise. Our mother was dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, though whether from embarrassment, anger, or relief, I couldn't tell. Camille, why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us believe? Because I tried to tell you, I said, my voice carrying years of frustration. Every time I mentioned my work, you dismissed it as playing with computers. When I talked about my investments, you changed the subject. When I tried to explain what I was building, no one seemed interested in hearing about it. This was the deeper truth that went beyond Cassey's social media campaign. Our family had never taken my financial pursuits seriously, creating an environment where my actual success became invisible, while Cassey's narrative of my failure seemed plausible. And honestly, I continued, feeling the weight of months of suppressed frustration, it was easier to let you assume I was struggling than to deal with the complicated dynamics that come with family members, knowing you're more financially successful than they are. The statement hung in the air, acknowledging the uncomfortable reality that my wealth would inevitably change family relationships in ways that might not be entirely positive. Cassey was staring at her hands, apparently fascinated by her own fingernails. What am I supposed to do now? She asked, her voice small and defeated. It was the first time she had acknowledged that she needed to do something, that this situation required action on her part rather than continued deflection or minimization. You're supposed to tell the truth, I said simply. You're supposed to acknowledge that you've been posting false information about me for months. You're supposed to take responsibility for the damage you've caused to my relationships and reputation. But my followers, she began. Your followers deserve to know that the content you've been providing about your family was inaccurate, I interrupted. And honestly, if your social media success depends on humiliating family members with false information, maybe you need to reconsider your content strategy. Our father was nodding slowly, his business background clearly helping him understand the scope of the ethical breach. Cassey, what you've done isn't just hurtful, it's potentially defamatory. You've been publicly making false statements about your sister's financial condition. The legal implications seemed to hit Cassey like a physical blow. She hadn't just been making family jokes, she had been making false public statements that could potentially rise to the level of defamation. I think, our mother said slowly, that we all need to take some time to process this. But Cassey, you owe your sister a very serious apology, and you owe your followers an explanation. The conversation continued for another hour, with family members asking questions, expressing embarrassment about their assumptions, and slowly adjusting to a completely new understanding of our family dynamics. But the central truth had been established: Cassie's broke sister narrative was fiction, and the fiction had caused real damage that would require real accountability to repair. As we prepared to leave, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: the relief of no longer carrying a secret that had been isolating me from my own family. The truth was complicated and would create new challenges, but it was infinitely better than the elaborate lie that had been poisoning my relationships. Cassey gathered her things in silence, her phone remaining face down on the table until the very end. As she finally picked it up, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "Camille," she said as we reached the front door, "I really am sorry. I didn't know it would." "You didn't want to know," I corrected gently but firmly. "There's a difference." As I drove home through the familiar streets of Millbrook Heights, I realized that everything had changed in the span of a single phone call. The secret that had protected my privacy had been shattered, but the lie that had damaged my relationships had been shattered too. For the first time in 8 months, I felt like myself again. The week following our family brunch was unlike anything I had experienced in recent memory. For months, I had been living in a strange dual reality where my private success existed alongside public perception of my failure. Now, with the truth finally revealed, I found myself navigating an entirely new landscape of relationships and expectations. The first significant change came Monday morning, when Cassey called me, her voice shaky and uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since we were teenagers. She had spent the previous day agonizing over how to address the situation with her social media followers, and she wanted to discuss her approach before posting anything public. "I've written something," she said, "but I wanted you to see it first. I know I don't have the right to ask for your approval, but I don't want to make this worse than it already is." She sent me a screenshot of a long Instagram post that began with the words, "I need to address something important about content I've been sharing." The post was thorough, acknowledging that she had been making assumptions about my financial situation without accurate information, apologizing for any embarrassment or confusion her posts had caused, and clarifying that her broke sister narrative had been based on misunderstandings rather than facts. What struck me most about her draft was how different her tone was from her usual social media voice. Gone were the casual jokes, the performative generosity, and the implicit requests for sympathy on my behalf. Instead, she had written something that sounded genuinely remorseful and accountable for the impact of her actions. "It's honest," I told her when she called back for my feedback. "I appreciate that you're taking responsibility instead of making excuses. I keep thinking about what you said," she admitted, "about how my content was affecting your real relationships. I never considered that people would actually change how they treated you based on what I posted." This conversation marked the beginning of what would become a series of difficult but necessary discussions between us over the following weeks. For the first time in our adult lives, we were having genuine conversations about the impact of our actions on each other, rather than simply performing our respective roles in the family dynamic we had inherited. Cassey posted her correction that evening, and the response was immediate and intense. Her followers, who had been invested in the broke sister narrative for months, expressed everything from understanding to disappointment to outright skepticism. Some questioned why she had been making assumptions about family members' financial situations in the first place. Others wondered what else in her content might be based on incomplete information. The post generated more engagement than any of her previous content, but not the kind of engagement she had been seeking. Instead of likes and sympathetic comments, she received dozens of questions about her credibility and the ethics of using family members' lives as content without their knowledge or consent. "I think I might take a break from posting for a while," she told me during one of our follow-up conversations. "I need to figure out how to create content that doesn't involve making assumptions about other people's lives." The impact extended far beyond social media. Our family dynamics began shifting in ways that were both subtle and profound. Our parents, who had spent months treating me with gentle concern, suddenly found themselves navigating conversations about investment strategies and real estate markets. The change was awkward at first, as they adjusted to seeing me as someone with financial expertise, rather than someone who needed financial assistance. Uncle Ronan, who had a background in business, became genuinely interested in learning about my investment approach. During our next family gathering, he asked detailed questions about portfolio diversification and market analysis, engaging with me as a peer rather than a family member who needed protection from complex financial discussions. Aunt Daisy's response was perhaps the most touching. She called me privately to apologize for the care packages and expressed embarrassment about assuming I needed help without ever asking directly about my situation. I realize now that I was making judgments based on surface appearances, she said. Your lifestyle looked modest, so I assumed you were struggling. But modest and struggling aren't the same thing. Are they? Her observation captured something essential about the entire situation. My choice to live below my means had been interpreted as inability to afford better, when in reality it was a strategic decision that enabled me to build substantial wealth over time. The most significant transformation, however, was in my relationship with financial privacy. For years I had kept my success largely hidden, partly to avoid complicated family dynamics, and partly because discussing wealth felt uncomfortable and potentially alienating. But the experience with Cassey had taught me that secrecy created space for others to construct their own narratives about my life, narratives that could be completely divorced from reality. I began being more open about my work and achievements, not in a boastful way, but in the honest way that people discuss their careers and accomplishments. When family members asked about my projects, I explained them clearly instead of deflecting. When friends inquired about my work, I described my investment activities with the same matter-of-fact tone that other people used to discuss their traditional employment. This openness led to unexpected opportunities for connection. Several family members and friends approached me for financial advice, genuinely interested in learning from someone who had achieved success in an area they found intimidating. I began hosting informal financial literacy sessions, sharing knowledge about budgeting, investing and wealth building with people who had previously seen me as someone who needed help, rather than someone who could provide it. The community impact was equally surprising. Word spread through our extended social network that the struggling sister from Cassey's posts was actually a successful investor, and people began reaching out with questions about everything from retirement planning to real estate investment. I found myself accidentally becoming a resource for friends and acquaintances who had never thought to ask for my input when they believed I was financially unsuccessful. Kelvin from Beacon Cafe provided one of the most memorable interactions during this transition period. When I stopped by for my usual coffee the week after the family revelation, he approached me with a sheepish expression. I heard through the grapevine that I might have misunderstood your situation, he said carefully. I feel pretty foolish about offering you that part-time job. You were trying to be helpful based on the information you had, I reassured him. There's nothing foolish about wanting to help someone you thought was struggling. Well, he said with a grin that suggested he was adjusting quickly to this new information. Maybe instead of offering you a job, I could ask for some advice about expanding the business. These interactions taught me something valuable about the difference between genuine privacy and defensive secrecy. I had thought I was protecting myself by keeping my financial success private, but I had actually been depriving myself of authentic relationships and meaningful conversations about something that occupied a significant portion of my life. The experience also changed my perspective on family dynamics and the stories we tell about each other. Cassey's memes hadn't emerged in a vacuum. They had built on existing family patterns where my choices were minimized or misunderstood. The broke sister narrative was an extreme version of a tendency that had been present for years, where my unconventional path was viewed as less legitimate than more traditional measures of success. But beyond the personal impact, the situation illuminated broader issues about social media, assumptions and the ways we construct narratives about other people's lives. Cassey's followers had been engaging with content about a real person's supposed struggles, expressing sympathy and sharing their own stories, all based on information that was fundamentally inaccurate. This raised uncomfortable questions about the ethics of using family members, friends or acquaintances as content without their explicit consent or accurate knowledge of their circumstances. How many social media posts about other people are based on assumptions rather than facts? How often do we share stories about friends and family members that serve our narrative purposes without considering their accuracy or impact? The incident also highlighted how easily financial assumptions can be made, and how difficult they can be to correct once they're established. People had looked at my modest lifestyle and assumed financial struggle, when the reality was strategic wealth building. The assumption felt reasonable based on surface appearances, but it was completely wrong, and it affected how people treated me in ways that extended far beyond social media. 3 months after the family brunch revelation, I received an unexpected message from one of Cassey's former followers. She had seen Cassey's correction post and wanted to share how the experience had changed her own approach to social media. Your sister's situation made me realize how often I make assumptions about people's lives based on their posts, she wrote. I've been more careful about judging people's circumstances, or sharing stories about friends without really knowing the full picture. This message from a complete stranger helped me understand that our family drama had accidentally become a teaching moment for people far beyond our immediate circle. The broke sister revelation had prompted broader conversations about social media ethics, financial assumptions, and the importance of distinguishing between what we observe and what we actually know about other people's lives. As I reflected on the entire experience, I realized that while Cassie's actions had been hurtful and damaging, they had also forced me to confront some of my own choices about privacy, communication, and family relationships. My decision to keep my success largely hidden had been motivated by good intentions, but it had also contributed to an environment where false narratives could flourish unchallenged. The resolution wasn't simple or entirely positive. Some relationships had been damaged in ways that would take time to repair. Cassey's credibility with her social media audience had been significantly undermined, and she was still working to rebuild trust with followers who felt misled by her content. Our family dynamics were still adjusting to new information about financial roles and capabilities. But the experience had also created opportunities for more authentic relationships and honest conversations. I was no longer carrying the burden of maintaining two separate identities, one private and successful, one public and struggling. Family members were engaging with me as I actually was rather than as they had assumed me to be. And I had learned valuable lessons about the importance of clear communication and the dangers of allowing others to construct narratives about your life without input or correction. 6 months later, Cassey and I were having coffee together at Beacon Cafe, when she brought up the subject that had dominated our conversations for so long. "I've been thinking about starting a new social media project," she said tentatively. "Something about financial literacy and challenging assumptions about wealth and success. Maybe featuring people whose financial situations aren't what they appear to be on the surface." It was a complete reversal from her previous content approach, and I could see that she was genuinely trying to channel her social media skills towards something more constructive and educational. "That sounds like it could be really valuable," I told her honestly. "There are a lot of misconceptions about what financial success looks like, and people could benefit from hearing diverse perspectives. Would you maybe consider being interviewed for it?" she asked. "I mean, your story about building wealth while living modestly could help people understand that there are different paths to financial security." The request represented a remarkable transformation in our relationship. Instead of using my life as content without my knowledge or consent, she was asking to collaborate on educational material that could genuinely help people understand financial concepts and challenge their assumptions about wealth and success. "I'd be interested in that," I said, realizing that this conversation represented a new chapter in both our relationship and our individual growth. As I think about this entire experience now, the most important lesson isn't about social media or family dynamics or even financial privacy. It's about the fundamental importance of allowing people to tell their own stories. When we make assumptions about others' lives, circumstances, or capabilities, we risk creating narratives that serve our purposes rather than reflecting their reality. Whether it's assuming someone is struggling financially based on their lifestyle choices, or assuming someone is successful based on their consumption patterns, or making any number of other judgments about people's circumstances without accurate information, we all have the capacity to create false narratives that can impact real relationships and real lives. The antidote to this tendency isn't perfect knowledge about everyone around us. That's neither possible nor necessary. Instead, it's humility about what we actually know versus what we assume, curiosity about others' experiences rather than certainty about their circumstances, and respect for people's right to define their own stories, rather than having those stories defined for them by others. If you're watching this and you've ever felt misunderstood or misrepresented by family members, friends, or social media, I want you to know that your truth matters more than others' assumptions. You don't owe anyone a performance of struggle or success that makes them comfortable. You have the right to live your life according to your values and priorities, even if those choices don't make sense to observers who don't understand your full situation. And if you've ever made assumptions about someone else's life, based on surface appearances or social media posts, I hope this story encourages you to ask more questions and make fewer judgments. The person you think is struggling might be building something remarkable behind the scenes. The person you assume is successful might be facing challenges you can't see. And the story you think you know about someone's life might be completely different from the story they would tell about themselves. The most radical thing you can do in a world full of assumptions and narratives is to let people be who they actually are, rather than who you think they should be based on incomplete information. Sometimes that means defending your own truth when others try to rewrite it. Sometimes it means admitting you were wrong about someone else's story. But it always means choosing curiosity over certainty, questions over assumptions, and authentic connection over performed narratives. Because at the end of the day, we all deserve to have our real stories told, not the versions that make other people comfortable, but the ones that reflect who we actually are and what we're actually building with our lives. The conference room at the Millbrook Heights Community Center was packed beyond its intended capacity, with folding chairs arranged in tight rows and people standing along the walls. I surveyed the crowd of nearly 200 attendees, who had come to hear about building wealth through strategic living, the financial literacy workshop series that had grown from informal family conversations into a recognized community program. What started as casual advice sharing with relatives had evolved into something much larger than I had ever anticipated. Word had spread through our extended network about the secret millionaire next door, whose story had challenged everyone's assumptions about what financial success looked like. Local newspapers had picked up the story, not focusing on the family drama, but on the broader lessons about wealth building and the misconceptions that prevent people from recognizing or pursuing financial independence. As I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the diverse audience, young professionals, recent college graduates, parents juggling multiple responsibilities, retirees looking to optimize their remaining years, I was struck by how dramatically my life had changed since that Sunday brunch revelation 2 years ago. Before we begin today's session, I said I want to acknowledge someone who has been instrumental in making this program possible. My sister Cassey, who is here today filming a documentary about financial literacy and family dynamics. Cassey waved from the back of the room, where she was operating a professional camera setup that represented her complete transformation from social media influencer to educational content creator. The journey from broke sister memes to legitimate financial education had been challenging for her, requiring her to rebuild her entire online presence and learn new skills in research, interviewing, and factual reporting. Her documentary project, Hidden Wealth Stories of Financial Success That Don't Look Like Success, had already featured 12 individuals whose financial situations were dramatically different from their appearances suggested. The project had gained attention from financial education organizations and media outlets interested in challenging stereotypes about wealth and success. "It's weird being behind the camera instead of in front of it," she had told me during one of our planning sessions. "But I'm learning more about people's real lives than I ever did when I was just looking for content that would get likes." The transformation hadn't been easy for either of us. Cassey had lost nearly half of her original followers when she changed her content focus from lifestyle entertainment to educational programming. Some of her former audience felt betrayed by the revelation that her broke sister narrative had been fictional, while others were simply uninterested in more serious content about financial planning and wealth building. But the new audience she was cultivating was more engaged and purposeful. Her educational content generated deeper conversations, attracted viewers who were genuinely interested in learning, and created opportunities for meaningful impact rather than just viral entertainment. I realize now that my old content was basically gossip disguised as family humor, she had reflected during one of our weekly coffee meetings. I was using real people's lives as entertainment without considering the consequences. Now I'm trying to use storytelling to actually help people understand complex topics. The documentary project had become a collaboration between us, with me serving as a financial expert while she handled the production and storytelling aspects. Working together had allowed us to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect, rather than the competitive dynamic that had characterized our interactions for years. Today's workshop was the culmination of the financial literacy program we had developed together. The curriculum covered everything from basic budgeting and debt management to advanced investment strategies and real estate acquisition. But the underlying message was always about challenging assumptions, both the assumptions people made about their own capabilities and the assumptions they made about what financial success required. The biggest myth about building wealth, I told the audience as I began the presentation, is that it requires a high income or special knowledge that most people don't have access to. The reality is that wealth building is more about discipline, patience, and strategic thinking than it is about earning power or financial sophistication. I clicked to the first slide, which showed a comparison between high consumption lifestyles and wealth building lifestyles. The images were carefully chosen to challenge visual assumptions: modest apartments that housed significant investment portfolios, expensive cars that represented massive opportunity costs, designer clothes that indicated spending priorities rather than financial security. 2 years ago, my own family believed I was struggling financially because I chose to live below my means while building an investment portfolio. They saw the surface indicators, a small apartment, a 10-year-old car, clothes from discount retailers, and assumed those indicators meant financial difficulty, rather than financial strategy. I told the abbreviated version of our story, focusing on the lessons rather than the family drama. The audience responded with nods of recognition, and occasional laughter, particularly when I described the moment when my private banker's call shattered everyone's assumptions about my financial situation. The point isn't that everyone should live as modestly as I chose to, I continued. The point is that financial success comes in many different forms, and the most sustainable wealth is often built by people who prioritize accumulation over consumption, at least during their wealth-building years. After the main presentation, we opened the floor for questions. The first hand belonged to a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s. "I'm just starting my career," she said, "and I feel pressure to look successful. Nice clothes, a good car, an apartment in the right neighborhood. How do you balance building wealth with maintaining the appearance that helps you professionally?" It was exactly the kind of question that demonstrated why this education was so important. The assumption that professional success required visible consumption was one of the biggest obstacles to wealth building for young professionals. "That's a great question," I replied, "and it touches on something that affects almost everyone early in their careers. The key is distinguishing between investments in your professional development and consumption for the sake of appearance." I explained the difference between strategic spending that genuinely enhanced career prospects and lifestyle inflation that simply drained resources without providing meaningful returns. The conversation that followed was rich and detailed, with audience members sharing their own struggles to balance financial goals with social and professional expectations. An older gentleman raised his hand next. "I'm 55 and feel like I'm starting late with serious wealth building. Is it possible to make meaningful progress when you don't have decades to let compound interest work?" His question led to a discussion about accelerated wealth-building strategies for people in mid-career, including real estate investment, business ownership opportunities, and tax-advantaged retirement planning. Several audience members shared their own experiences with late-start financial planning, creating a supportive environment where people felt comfortable discussing their challenges and successes. The session ran 30 minutes longer than scheduled because the audience was so engaged with the material and each other. When we finally concluded, people lingered to continue conversations, exchange contact information, and ask follow-up questions about specific aspects of financial planning. Cassey approached me as I was packing up my presentation materials. "That was incredible," she said, her camera finally lowered after 2 hours of filming. "The energy in the room, the quality of questions, the way people were connecting with each other, this is exactly what I hoped we could create." As we loaded equipment into my car, a new hybrid SUV that represented the first major lifestyle upgrade I had made since revealing my financial success, I reflected on how much our relationship had evolved. We had moved from competition and conflict to genuine collaboration, building something together that was more meaningful than either of us could have created alone. The drive home took us through downtown Millbrook Heights, where the commercial property I had purchased 2 years ago was now home to a thriving farmers market and artisan food hall. The investment had performed exactly as projected, providing steady rental income while contributing to the neighborhood's economic development. "You know what's funny," Cassey said as we passed the building. 2 years ago, I was making jokes about your financial situation, and now I'm getting financial advice from real estate developers who want to know how you identify undervalued properties." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. My investment success had become well known in local business circles, leading to consulting opportunities, partnership proposals, and requests for advice from other investors. The visibility that I had once avoided was now an asset that created additional income streams and business opportunities. But perhaps the most satisfying change was in our family dynamics. Our parents had become genuinely interested in learning about investment strategies and financial planning, treating me as an expert rather than someone who needed protection. Uncle Ronan had started a small investment club that met monthly to discuss market trends and share research. Aunt Daisy had begun her own modest investment portfolio and regularly called to discuss her progress and ask questions. Even our extended family gatherings had taken on a different character. Instead of careful avoidance of money-related topics, conversations often included discussions about financial goals, investment opportunities, and wealth-building strategies. I had become a resource for relatives facing major financial decisions, from home purchases to retirement planning to business ventures. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if that bank call had come 10 minutes later," Cassey mused as we arrived at my apartment building. Or if you had been somewhere else when it came in. I think the truth would have come out eventually, I replied. The gap between reality and your narrative was getting too big to sustain. Something would have forced it into the open. Maybe, she agreed. But I'm glad it happened the way it did. The shock of that moment made me realize how far I had gone with something that started as harmless teasing. If it had been a gradual revelation, I might not have understood the full impact of what I was doing. That evening, after Cassey left to edit the day's footage, I sat in my home office reviewing the financial education materials we had developed over the past year. The curriculum had grown to include workshops on everything from basic budgeting to advanced investment strategies, and we were planning to expand the program to other communities. But beyond the formal educational content, I was most proud of the conversations we had sparked about assumptions, narratives, and the complexity of people's financial lives. The broke sister story had resonated with so many people because it illustrated something universal: the way we all make judgments about others' circumstances based on incomplete information. My phone buzzed with a text message from our cousin Lovely, whose wedding I had attended the previous month. "Thank you again for the generous gift," she wrote, "and for the financial planning session last weekend. James and I are already implementing your suggestions for our savings plan." The wedding gift had been substantial, more than most family members had contributed, but it was given freely and proudly rather than grudgingly or secretly. The financial planning session had been a wedding gift of a different kind, helping the new couple establish strategies for building wealth together from the beginning of their marriage. These interactions represented the kind of authentic relationships I had been missing during the years when I kept my financial success largely hidden. Instead of being excluded from family planning or treated as someone who needed help, I was now positioned as someone who could provide meaningful assistance and advice. The irony was that revealing my wealth had actually made money less important in my family relationships, not more. When everyone had thought I was struggling, money was always present as a source of tension and concern. Now that my financial security was established and acknowledged, conversations could focus on other aspects of life and relationships. As I prepared for bed that night, I checked my investment portfolio one final time, a habit that had remained constant throughout all the changes in my personal and family life. The numbers continued their steady upward trajectory, reflecting not just successful investment strategies, but also the compound benefits of time, patience, and consistent discipline. But the figures on the screen represented more than just financial success. They represented the vindication of choices that had been misunderstood, the validation of strategies that had seemed foolish to observers, and the foundation for a life of freedom and purpose that extended far beyond monetary concerns. 2 years ago, I had been trapped between a private truth and a public lie, unable to share my actual achievements while watching my reputation be systematically damaged by someone who claimed to care about me. Tonight I was falling asleep in an apartment I owned, in a neighborhood where I had become a recognized contributor, surrounded by relationships built on authentic understanding rather than false assumptions. The broke sister memes that had once caused me such pain had ultimately become the catalyst for positive changes I never could have anticipated. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing that follows. And sometimes the person who hurts you most becomes your closest collaborator in healing the very wounds they created. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt grateful for all of it: the pain and the healing, the lies and the truth, the isolation and the connection. Every piece of the experience had been necessary to bring me to this place of authentic success, genuine relationships, and meaningful purpose. Tomorrow would bring new investment opportunities to evaluate, new workshops to plan, and new conversations about the complex relationship between appearance and reality in financial life. But tonight, for the first time in years, everything felt exactly as it should be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.